Welcome to my garden, to the GinGee GoodEarth program. I welcome you here today. It is the 9th of August 2020. And this is a GinGee GoodEarth production. Production numeral 8. Part 20A, Director GinGee GoodEarth. You can call me Ginger Lily, and you can write me at gibsongirls@mail.com. This is a program on the universal history of the United States of America, the America peoples on Earth, August 9th, 2020, USA. Take love. The only place where success comes before work is in the dictionary. Vince Lombardi. Liberty is one's potential for success in life. Gretchen Schmidt. Flea markets. I went to the famous Jamestown flea market this weekend. And I got this lovely vase that's from Europe, and it was in a trash dump that someone dug out old bottles and glass, and I bought this beautiful pot. There's a scene on it's a perfume bottle from Europe. England, she said, England. So it's part of the display. This is my musical instrument of bells, handmade from a stick and bells. And I want to start today. I want to get right into the book, A Universal History of the United States of America. And again, we're on page 140, and we'll back up a little bit as I usually do. So we're on page 133, A Universal History of the United States, Part 3, Chapter 6, a summary view of the causes that led to the American Revolution. And I'm going to kind of go over some of the paragraph important parts. And then we'll get to page 140, because that's where we left off, page 140. Although the narrow and illiberal policy of the British government towards her North American colonies from their first settlement was calculated to alienate the affections of the colonies from the parent country, yet from their exposed situation and habitual loyalty, this unworthy conduct, long persevered in, produced no sensible impression on the Americans. Their loyalty and attachment to the interests of Britain were not in the smallest degree impaired down to the period of the Peace of Paris in 1763. Never had they shown so much zeal or made such a great sacrifices in the cause of their country as during the preceding war, having lost more than 25,000 men, expended all the revenues they could raise, and involved themselves deeply in debt. Almost the whole burdens of the war in America had fallen on the colonies, and their exertions were altogether disproportionate to their means, intended greatly to impoverish and distress them. After 8 years' arduous struggles attended with the greatest sacrifices, the successful termination of the war, the dominion of France in America being relinquished forever, occasioned universal joy throughout the colonies. they forgot their sufferings and distresses in the fair prospects which the peace afforded. But these prospects were of short duration. The Peace of Paris formed a new era in the views and conduct of Great Britain towards her colonies in America. The possessions of France in America having been ceded to Britain, and having no longer any fear of her power in this hemisphere, a system of measures was pursued towards the colonies, originating in jealousy and tending to despotism. As soon as the colonies had fought their way in a condition which afforded the prospect of rapidly increasing in population and wealth, attempts were made to restrict their economical and political privileges, and gradually to reduce them to the most wretched state of colony vassalage. For a century and a half, the colonies had been left to themselves as to taxation. Their own local assemblies had provided the necessary revenues to defray the expenses of their governments, and the Parliament of Great Britain had neither directly nor indirectly ever attempted to derive a dollar of revenue from America. Although various acts had from time to time been passed regulating the trade and commerce of the colonies, yet none of these were designed or regarded, either in Britain or America, as revenue laws. But in an auspicious moment, the British ministry conceived the idea of taxing the colonies under the pretense of providing for their protection, but in reality to relieve the nation from the immense debt and weight of which hung heavily upon it. This iniquitous scheme originated with the cabinet, was easily introduced into the Parliament, and in March 1764, as a prelude to the memorable Stamp Act, the House of Commons resolved that towards further defraying the necessary expenses of protecting the colonies, it may be necessary to charge certain stamp duties upon them. And this resolution was forwarded by what was commonly called the Sugar Act, passed on the 5th of April and introduced by the following truly alarming preamble. Whereas it is just and necessary that a revenue be raised in America for defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the same, we the Commons, and towards raising the same, give in great unto your Majesty, after the 29th day of September 1764, on clay, sugar, indigo, and coffee, of foreign produce, and various other articles, the sum of the company C. There was the first act adopted by the Parliament for the avowed object of raising a revenue in the colonies. The justice of this measure, which appeared so clear to the British Parliament, was regarded in America as oppression and tyranny, and occasioned great excitement and alarm. The deceptive pretension that the revenue was to be raised for the purpose of protecting the colonies was not only added insult to injustice, as the colonies supposed that they were capable of protecting themselves, and they apprehended that the object was rather under the pretense of affording them protection to maintain a military force in America for the purpose of dragooning them into submission and enforcing an unconstitutional system of taxation, thereby rendering them the instruments of forging their own chains. This act was rendered more disgusting by a provision that money raised by it must be paid in specie, and another, and those charged with having violated the revenue laws might be prosecuted in the courts of admiralty, whereby they were deprived of the privilege of trial by a jury, and were liable to be condemned by a single officer of the crown, whose salary was to be paid from the very forfeitures decreed by himself. And this was not all, or even the worst, of the trial was conducted on such principles that the accused, contrary to the well-known maxims of the common law, the repugnant to every idea of justice, was obliged to prove himself innocent or suffer the penalties of the law. These iniquitous proceedings destroyed all security of property, and left everyone at the mercy of the minions of the British Crown. Their pernicious influence was soon felt extensively in the colonies. They no longer regarded Great Britain as an affectionate mother, but viewed her in the light of a selfish, cruel, and imperious stepmother. The designs of the ministry were penetrated and occasioned great alarm, which spread wider and wider until it became universal. The press, that great engine of truth and liberty, was called into requisition. The subject was ably and elaborately discussed, and the more it was discussed, and the better it was understood, the more strong and determined the opposition became. All the colonies petitioned and remonstrated against these obnoxious measures, and most of them appointed agents to present their memorials to Parliament or the King. But notwithstanding the opposition and excitement in America, and the remonstrances of the colonies, Mr. Grenville, who was at the head of the Treasury, prepared the Stamp Bill and introduced it into Parliament in February 1765, and although opposed with all the powers of eloquence by Alderman Beckford, Mr. Jackson, Colonel Burr, Sir William Meredith, and others, it was adopted by the great majority. 50 only voted in opposition, not out of about 300 members who were present. On the second reading of the bill, various petitions, not only from the colonies, but from the London merchants interested in the American trade, were presented. But the petitions were not even received, being refused on the plea that no memorial could be received on a money bill. Having passed both houses of Parliament, on the 22nd of March, the Stamp Act received the royal assent. Dr. Franklin, then in England, as agent for Pennsylvania, wrote to Charles Thomson afterwards. So Dr. Franklin was Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Then in England, as an agent for Pennsylvania, wrote to Charles Thomson, afterwards Secretary of Congress, "The sun of liberty is set. You must light up the lamps of industry and economy." Mr. Thomson, in a spirited reply, observed that he thought other lights would be lighted up to resist these unconstitutional measures. It is unnecessary to add that this prediction was soon fulfilled. This unjust and impolitic act was the first great cause which led to the American Revolution. Indeed, it was substantially the first scene in the bloody drama of that revolution. So, this unjust and impolitic act was the first great cause which led to the American Revolution. Indeed, it was substantially the first scene in the bloody drama of that revolution. It was passed in Parliament, and on the 7th of February, 1765, under the ministry of Lord Grenville, and was repealed on the 18th of March, 1766, from the influence of Mr. Pitt, Fort Pitt. This period of 13 months was the most eventful and tumultuous of any which had hitherto occurred. The apprehensions of the people were roused to the highest pitch, and the most determined spirit of opposition prevailed throughout the colonies. The Americans had not believed that the act would be passed, and on receiving the intelligence, everyone was struck with astonishment and filled with consternation. They looked at each other with amazement, and for a short interval hesitated what course to pursue, but soon recovering from their consternation, they determined not to submit to such a flagrant outrage of their rights. In Boston, the ships in the harbor, in token of the deepest mourning, suspended their colors half-mast high. The bells were rung muffled, and the obnoxious act with a death's head in front of it, with the motto, "The folly of England and the ruin of America," was carried in solemn procession about the streets. The discontent soon spread throughout the colonies, and the opposition became general and determined. The spirit of the people gave a tone to the colonial assemblies. The bold and decided resolutions were adopted against the iniquitous scheme of parliamentary taxation. Virginia took the lead, and on the 28th of May, 1765, Patrick Henry introduced his celebrated resolutions into the House of Burgesses. And in the week of history, and I want to continue on that page where Patrick Henry is introducing a wonderful thing, but this is the Kids for Only page in the Epic Times newspaper, and they have a Bill of Rights, this weekly history on the Bill of Rights. So, public domain, James Madison. On June 8, 1789, James Madison introduced the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Addressing the House of Representatives, Madison proposed 17 amendments, of which 10 were finally approved in December 1791. The famous list of fundamental rights includes the First Amendment, which secures freedom of speech, the press, assembly, religious expression, and protest, for example. So, keep your face to the sun and you will never see the shadows. Helen Keller, the American author and educator. So I wanted to read over that, and so we're still early on, around 1765, but the Bill of Rights were proposed on June 8th, 1789. But again, I like reading the newspaper. So now we're back to Patrick Henry. On May 28th of 1765, Virginia took the lead, introduced his celebrated resolutions into the House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry, which declared that the inhabitants of the colony were entitled to and possessed and enjoyed all the rights, liberties, and privileges of the people of Great Britain, that the General Assembly of the colony had always exercised and alone possessed the power to levy taxes and imposed on the inhabitants of the colony, and that they were not bound to yield obedience in any law or ordinance whatsoever designed to impose any taxation whatever upon them, other than the law and ordinances of the General Assembly. So bold and unexpected were these resolutions that the whist they were reading, one of the members cried out, "Treason! Treason!" These resolutions were communicated to all the colonies, and the spirit they breathed spread from one legislator to another, and their sentiments were reiterated in resolutions adopted by the legislatures. and the freemen in public meetings. Committees were appointed by the assemblies of the colonies to correspond with each other and to meet for constitution the object which was to secure harmony of feeling and concert of action. These measures had a very happy effect in the meantime. The press teemed with the constant publications vindicating the rights of the colonies, and many of them were of highly inflammatory character, calculated to raise the public mind to the highest pitch. The pulpit also, particularly in New England, labored in the same cause with great zeal and effect. The flame of liberty kindled from breast to breast and spread from province to province until the conflagration became general. The spirit of the opposition ran so high as to break out into acts of tumult and disorder. In Boston, the effigy of Mr. Oliver, the stamp master, was burnt and his house assailed, partly demolished, and his furniture destroyed, and soon after the house of William Stower, deputy register of the Court of Admiralty, was attacked, and the books and files of the court destroyed, and the house of Benjamin Hallowell, controller of the customs, shared with the same fate. These outrages were followed by a more bold and daring attack upon the dwelling of Mr. Hutchinson, lieutenant governor of the province. He was obliged to flee to save his life, and his house was entirely demolished, except the walls and everything in it destroyed or carried off. Similar outrages were committed in other places. In Connecticut, Mr. Ingersoll, the stamp officer, was burnt in an effigy in many towns, and whilst he was proceeded from New Haven to Hartford, where the assembly was in session, he was pursued and overtaken by a large concourse of people, some from more than 30 miles, and compelled to resign his office, which was followed by 3 hearty cheers of liberty and property. This took place at Withersfield, from whence the people, who were headed by the militia officers, proceeded to Hartford, where Mr. Ingersoll was compelled to read his resignation in the hearing of the assembly, which was succeeded by loud acclamations of liberty and property. In New York, the stamp officer was compelled to resign, and Lieutenant Governor Colden was burnt in an effigy with a stamp bill in his hand, suspended from his own coach, and the whole was consumed together. In the southern colonies, the public feeling did not lead to the same excesses, but in all of them means were found to compel the stamp officers to resign, and in all the colonies the assemblies adopted resolutions in opposition to the Stamp Act, although in many of them the rural governors prorogued the attempted to stop their proceedings. The members of the colonial assemblies were animated and encouraged by the people, who in most of the towns instructed them to oppose the Stamp Act. But the most important measure to unite the colonies was give energy and effort to their opposition, was convening a continental congress consisting of deputies appointed by each colony. These measures was first proposed by the Assembly of Massachusetts. The meeting was appointed to be holden in New York in October of 1765. All the colonies except New Hampshire, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia sent deputies. The 3 last of these colonies were prevented by the governors, and the first excused himself on account of its particular situation. The Congress, after mature deliberation, adopted a Declaration of Rights and a statement of the grievances of the colonies, and asserted in the strongest terms their exemption from all taxes not imposed by their own representatives. It also prepared a petition to the House of Commons. At the 1st of November, the time when the Stamp Act was to go into operation, approached public feeling became still stronger, and was excited to the utmost to prevent the execution of the law. In New York, 10 boxes of stamps, which had arrived there for Connecticut, were seized by the populace and burned. In other ports, the masters of vessels which brought out the stamps were compelled to return with their detestable cargoes, or deliver them up to the people to be destroyed. In Boston and many of the principal towns, the 1st of November was kept as a day of mourning and deep distress. All the shops were shut, the bells were tolled muffled, and the effigies of the authors and abettors of the act were carried in procession through the streets, and then torn to pieces and consumed by the flames. The lawyers of the Supreme Court in New Jersey resolved that they would not purchase the stamps in their professional business, and that they would relinquish their practice as a sacrifice to the public good. And the principal merchants in the colonies and great numbers of other classes of the inhabitants entered into solemn engagement not only to refuse to use stamps, but also not to import any more goods from Great Britain until the Stamp Act should be repealed. Associations were formed called the Sons of Liberty. The object which was to assist and protect with force, if necessary, everyone who might be in danger from his resistance or opposition to the Stamp Act. This behold association originated in New York and prevailed throughout New England, and had not the act been repealed, must have led to civil war. The restrictive measures produced distress and tumults in England, a large number of the manufacturers being thrown out of employment, and more than 40,000 with black flags appeared in the streets in London, and surrounded the royal palace and Parliament House. Fortunately, a change of the ministry took place, in consequence of what was called the Regency Bill, and Lord Grenville was succeeded by the Marquis of Rockingham as First Lord of the Treasury, and the Duke of Grafton and General Conway were appointed Secretaries of State. In January, the Parliament met. The affairs of America occupied the principal attention, and the first talents of the House were engaged in the discussion. Mr. Pitt, who had been confined to his bed by sickness when the Stamp Act was passed, now came forward as the great champion of the rights of the Americans, and with his manly and all-powerful eloquence opposed the unjust, unconstitutional, and dangerous measure. He even justified the Americans in their resistance of a Stamp Act of tyranny and oppression. After a long and animated discussion, the act was repealed, accompanied, however, with a declaration that the King and the Parliament had, and of a right ought to have, full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force bind the colonies, and his Majesty's subjects in them, in all cases whatever. An act of indemnity was also passed. The repeal of the obnoxious act occasioned universal joy, both in Great Britain and America. The ships in the Thames displayed their colors, and the whole city of London was illuminated, and in the colonies, notwithstanding the declaratory act asserting the principle of taxation, the joy and rejoicing were universal. The non-importation resolutions were rescinded, animosities, ill-treatment, and everything past were forgotten, and commercial intercourse with Great Britain was resumed with greater activity than ever before and had ever been witnessed. The colonies hoped and believed that harmony would now be restored, and did everything in their power to promote this desirable objective. But the officers of the Crown, the minions of power, but the officers of the crown and the minions of power and the expectants of place kept up a correspondence with the officers of the British government at home and attempted to promote their own selfish views of misrepresenting their countrymen. Governor Barnard of Massachusetts was the head of this party, which contributed so much to breed difficulties and bring matters to a crisis. Notwithstanding that the Declaratory Act still hung over the heads of the colonies like a portentous cloud, it was not generally expected that the British government would ever soon make another so dangerous an experiment. But these reasonable expectations, however, soon proved to be fallacious, and all reliance on the justice of liberality of Britain was found to be deceptive and dangerous. Around every cloud is a silver lining. Notwithstanding the distraction into which the colonies had been thrown by the Stamp Act within a few months after its repeal, and before the wounds it had occasioned had had time to heal, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, came forward with a new scheme of taxing America, and was so sanguine in his views that he pledged his character for the success of the project. The new revenue scheme was to take off the duties on teas, which were paid in Great Britain, and to levy 3 pence per pound on all that was purchased with tea in America, and also duty on paper, glass, and several other articles. A board of customs was established, and commissioners appointed to set in Boston to collect the duties, and the custom officers were to be paid for the revenue thus raised, and the governor judges of the Superior Court and other officers in Massachusetts who had hitherto been dependent on their salaries on the Assembly to render them independent of the people and more devoted to Great Britain, were also to be paid from these revenues, and to carry the iniquitous system into effect, as unjust laws can only be enforced by unjust means. The powers of the Court of Admiralty were greatly extended so as to deprive the people of trial by jury in prosecutions for violating the revenue laws. Writs of assistance, as they were called, issued by the governor or any other officer of the revenue, authorized searching the house of the most respectable inhabitant in the province on suspicion of the concealment of contraband or smuggled goods. When intelligence of these new parliamentary regulations reached America, they occasioned universal astonishment and revived all the excitement and alarm which prevailed during the Stamp Act. So the first meeting on the tax on tea was in Edmonton, North Carolina, off the shore of the coast of North Carolina, before the Boston Tea Party in Massachusetts. When intelligence of these new parliamentary regulations reached America, I have samples of tea leaves, so I'll share them with you sometime. When intelligence of these new parliamentary regulations reached America, they occasioned universal astonishment, and revived all the excitement and alarm which prevailed during the Stamp Act. In the minds of reflecting men, they were regarded a more dangerous than that obnoxious act, as an indirect and undisguised system of taxation had a more certain and fatal tendency to undermine the liberties and enslave the people than direct taxes. The colonies, assailed by the same injuries, had recourse to their former measures of complaint and supplication, but their petitions were not even read, and their remonstrances treated with contempt, thus adding insult to injustice. This accumulated injuries and the indignities aroused the fears and spirits of the colonies, and a circular letter addressed to the other colonies by the Assembly of Massachusetts contributed to diffuse the flame and led to concert of action. This letter was dated the 11th of February, 1768, and the sentiments it contained were reiterated by most of the colony assemblies. From the bold and determined conduct of the Assembly of Massachusetts, it was prorogued by the governor. Another assembly convened in May following, in which the governor, in his first communication, insolently demanded of them, as required by the British Secretary of State, to rescind the resolutions of the preceding assembly, which led to the circular letter, and intimidated, and unless they complied immediately, they would be dissolved at once. But the Assembly acted with the firmness which became the defenders of liberty, and instead complying with this haughty mandate, petitioned the king for the removal of the royal governor, and charged upon him a long catalogue of crimes. The governor, exasperated at their conduct, immediately dissolved the mutinous assembly and applied to the commander-in-chief of the king's troops, then in New York, to have several additional regiments sent to Boston. Alarmed at these circumstances, the inhabitants of Boston besought the governor to convene another assembly, but he treated their request with contempt. The crisis required something to be done without delay, and accordingly letters were written to every town in the colony, requesting the appointment of delegates to meet in the convention at Boston before the arrival of the troops. Delegates from 96 towns met on the 22nd of September. The governor instantly sent them an angry message, commanding them to disperse, threatening, in case of refusal, that they would suffer the consequences of their temerity. The convention, however, was not frightened in submission, but gave their reasons for convenience, continued their deliberations, and prepared the petition to the king. On the 1st of October, the troops arrived and landed, and sword in hand paraded through the streets of Boston, which were filled with the vast crowds, who, with sullen silence, denoted the deepest resentment. Witness this, the first act in the great and bloody drama about to be performed. No tumult or resistance, however, ensued. Notwithstanding, the troops were quartered in the houses of the inhabitants. This assembly met in May 1769, and immediately adopted several spirited resolutions, that the placing an armed force where the legislature was convened to overawe the deliberations was a breach of privilege, and that the quartering of troops on the inhabitants in time and peace was illegal, and a violation of the rights and liberties of British subjects. A standing army was now stationed in the capital of Massachusetts for the avowed object of coercing the inhabitants into submission. Coercing the inhabitants into submission. Their commerce fettered. Thy characters introduced. The assembly prevented from meeting, and the petitions of all classes to have the assembly convened, treated with contempt by an insolent governor, who threatened to argument the troops and enforce at all hazards his arbitrary and tyrannical measures. It cannot be surprising that the fears and exasperations of the people exceeded what had ever been witnessed before. At this alarming conjuncture, something must be done, and there was no other alternative but submission or resistance of petitions had been treated with such contempt that to memorialize any branch of the British government would be equivalent to submission, and there were but two ways of resistance, either an appeal to the sword or an entire There were but two ways of resistance, either an appeal to the sword or an entire suspension of all commercial intercourse with Great Britain, which, as was said by Mr. Pitt in his speech, furnished the means whereby Britain had carried on the war with France, and which, if continued, would afford the means of their own oppression. And all the colonies were involved in one common danger. They readily entered into the most solemn engagements that no British or India goods should be imported, except a few specified articles of necessary use. The effects of these arrangements were soon felt in England, and produced clamors and even tumults in some parts of the kingdom. But the partisans of the crown in America endeavored by their correspondence to induce the ministry to persevere in their oppressive measures, and represented in the strongest terms that the interruption of commerce was only the effort of desperation, which could not last long. They advised the ministry to purchase large quantities of goods designed for the American market, and also to allow the merchants engaged in the American trade a premium equal to the profits of their stock in business. If these measures are adopted, said Mr. Oliver, secretary in Massachusetts, in one of his letters, the game will soon be up with my countrymen. The assembly, which convened at Boston in May, sat several weeks without doing any business, as they refused to act as long as armed forces was quartered in the town, and surrounded the house where they were in session. They were finally adjourned to Cambridge. They sent several messengers to the governor to have the troops removed, but after invading the matter for some time, he declared that he had no authority over the king's troops, thus admitting that the military was above the civil power in the province. Governor Bernard sent a provoking message, stating the expenditures of quartering the troops on the town, and requesting that provisions be made for the same, and also for their future support. The assembly were thus called on to maintain the instruments by which they were to be oppressed and enslaved. But instead of complying with this request, they passed several spirited resolutions, ensuring the conduct of the governor and General Gage for their rash and oppressive measures, their wanton violations of the Constitution, their introduction of a standing army in the time of peace, and their encroachments on the liberties of the citizens and of the province. The governor had received an order to repair to England and lay before the king the state of the colony, which he communicated to the assembly with a request that his salary might be continued during his absence at his office would remain. But the Assembly informed him in decided terms that they could not comply with either of his requests. On receiving this answer, he immediately, after a short and angry and threatening speech, prorogued the legislature. He soon after set sail for Europe, then little thinking that he should never return to a country that by his violent temper and arbitrary conduct he had brought to the brink of civil war. His reception at court convinced the Americans of the truth of what they had feared, that the governor had been sent for as a mischievous emissary rather than for the impartial inquiry into the real situation of the province or an investigation of his own conduct. Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor, was appointed to succeed Governor Barnard. Hutchinson was a native of Boston and had run a career of popularity whilst, however, he was courting the people at home. He was not less assiduous and integrating himself into the favor of the British government. By misrepresenting his countrymen, he was artful and plausible and possessed of popular talents, but was insidious, dark, intriguing, and ambitious, and the extreme of avarice marked every feature of his character. His appointment was announced at the close of the year 1769. And we're going to stop there on page 146 on the Universal History of the United States of America. And we have 10 more pages about that. And we will be going into the punishment of a man from Billerica who purchased a gun from British soldier in Boston, 1775. The Battle of Lexington. And it goes on. We're on page 1. We just finished at 146, and we're still going. 167. And then on page 173, we will meet commanded by Captain Lamb. Next entered the main body, brought up by the rear, Colonel Arnold, Colonel Morgan, General Montgomery, and then the Revolution continued, chapter 7. That's on page 173. And we're only at 146, so we have a lot of fun things to learn and read. And again, I'm reading with you and learning.